to cover tonight, and I'm sure you guys would like to be able to follow along. So we are in, again, 1 Samuel 17, and this happens to be today's, I hit a button, there we go. We happen to be at David and Goliath in the McShane reading plan. And, I just wanted to finish up these last couple of weeks of my paternity leave time where I've been trying to do, stuff I've taught before, stuff I didn't need to study all week for. And when I saw that today's reading plan landed us here, I thought that'd be just a great chapter. I've been kind of jonesing for a David fix. I love King David. I love the stories of Samuel and Chronicles, and not just David, all of the stuff in there. It's just such fun stories. I love the Old Testament. I love Judges, and I love going through Joshua, and just those battles and things are so much fun. And so that's where we've been reading as a family lately too, and so it's just been good to go through all that. So we're going to go through here, and for what it's worth, for those who haven't been around this long, when I taught 1 Samuel 17, it was an online message during the very beginning of COVID. In fact, it was our Easter message. We were in 1 Samuel right at the beginning of 2020 at the time of Easter. And so that message, not only was it going through 1 Samuel, but I spent a lot of time actually speaking about the resurrection. So in some ways, I spent less time teaching 1 Samuel 17 because we were also trying to make it an Easter message at the same time. So it'd be fun to kind of just go back and redo this chapter. So King David has just shown up on the scene in the previous chapter. Up until now, in the book of 1 Samuel, it's all been about Samuel and then King Saul. And we've already seen chapter 15, to obey is better than to sacrifice, and the heat and the fat of rams. And so we have Saul has rebelled. Saul has been told he's not going to be the king, and that God has found a man after his own heart. And in chapter 16, he gets anointed. Samuel goes and anoints David. And then at the end of 16, we'll even flip back in a second and look at it, we have David is actually called to King Saul to minister to him because David was a musician. And so he'd play him music and soothe him when he was being pestered by a distressing spirit. But now we find a battle is brewing. And so chapter 17, verse 1, it says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle and were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes-Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array against the Philistines." Verse 3, the Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side with the valley between them. So here we have sitting on we're on top of Azekah, where this picture is being taken. This is where the Israelite camp was. And down there, all that green grass, and going behind the hill, kind of in the middle front there, that's the Elah Valley. And so zooming out of this picture, I kind of have things, all right, I clicked the wrong one. That's the one I want. Yes, so that's the picture we were just looking at. We've now backed out. Azekah is where we're sitting. Socoh is on the far side, that hill over there. There's this valley and a hill with a town on it, Sha'araim, and that's mentioned at the end of the chapter. So if you look all the way down into verse 52, it talks about how, "And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Sha'araim, even as far as Gath and Ekron." And so as we look this direction, straight out that way takes us to the Mediterranean Sea, and it's along that sea coast where the Philistines were settled. So all the 5 major cities, they had smaller cities, but there was really the 5 cities of the Philistines. Let's see if I remember them now. We have Gath, we have Ekron, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and what's the other one I'm thinking of here? Gaza. Forgot about Gaza. Isn't that funny? The one that's still, very big and in the news. So there's all the cities back that way. And really this valley leads into Philistine territory. Now, standing on top of Sha'araim, Azekah is on the right, Socoh's on the left, and there's the valley in the middle. So I'm just kind of giving you guys just a view of this territory. And there's this big valley, and they would battle there from time to time. Standing in the valley, Azekah is on the back right. And here we're standing on, at the time, at least in this moment, it's a dry riverbed. And this is the only brook river that is in the Elah Valley. Only one river runs through there. So David's going to go and find himself some stones from the riverbed. And that's the only riverbed you can get stones from. So it's kind of easy to know where you're looking. On that note, there'll be three things I'll be making reference to in the back of the church sanctuary tonight, and one of which is there's a small bucket back there, and it's filled with stones from the riverbed of the Elah Valley. You can feel free to help yourself to one if you'd like. I told the teacher downstairs, the kids are also doing David and Goliath, that kids could have one too, so don't steal all the rocks before the kids get some. But I brought a bunch back so people could have a rock for killing giants. In fact, I think I actually left my rock right here. Ta-da! And so, yeah, tons of these rocks there. I would always walk way up the stream to gather all my rocks. That way I know that they're like, from the actual creek bed. I hear they ship in rocks because people keep taking them and they need more rocks for tourists. So that's the layout of the land. It says at the end of verse 1, there is Ephes Damim. It literally means the boundary of blood. Now, one reason possibly for that name is because battles happened here. When the Philistines would come, they would come, and this seems to be where they'd always stop at. There is a Jewish city there, Sharaim, so they'd get that far, they'd stop just outside that city, and there'd be battles in this valley. And so they have this basically boundary of blood. They continue to fight in this one place. And as we move forward, I can't help but look at all the cool pictures and types of Christ, that there is a boundary of blood and the enemies cannot cross over it. It's kind of the stopping point, the things that have been protected and covered by the blood of Jesus. Now, it says in verse 4, a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. So, right off the bat, it's interesting. The word champion here, the Hebrew is Ish Benaim, and what that means literally is like the man in the middle. The champion was the man in the middle, and that's the literal Hebrews, it's the man in the middle, because it's one man who would stand on behalf of all the people. The Philistines had their champion, his name was Goliath, one man who represented all of Israel. Now, this was not an uncommon thing in those days. I don't know if you guys seen it, and it's been so long, I don't know how appropriate the movie was, but I remember the movie Troy, and Achilles was played by Brad Pitt, I think. And in that movie, at the beginning of the movie, where's Achilles? Where's Achilles? They're supposed to be fighting a battle, and there's this giant guy on the other side, and they get Achilles to fight him, and Achilles wins the battle, and the other army surrenders. This was a thing that was done in those days. It wasn't uncommon. It's not unique to the story of David and Goliath. It was a typical thing where, hey, we can all fight, because war was just really normal back then. We can all fight, and lots of people will die, or we'll make a deal. One-on-one. You send your best, we'll send our best, and whoever wins, the other side will just surrender. And so they sent out a guy by the name of Goliath. Now, it's interesting. It's a name that's a little hard to translate. I like some of the older guys, Gesenius, and his interpretation of the name. His name coming from really to uncover, but it means to exile. But there's some cool stuff. His name, Goliath, to exile or to uncover. And we're going to find that Goliath is very much a picture of Satan in this. That there's a story here with real people and real events, but there's so many lessons we can glean by looking at this from different angles. And one, of course, is that he's a picture of Satan. He's a picture of the enemy. And his name means to exile, which means to get alone. And it means to uncover, which in the Old Testament, and many of you, I'm sure this is clicking, the uncovering and the shame. I will uncover them and expose them and make them ashamed. The idea of nakedness, that it'd be embarrassing and shameful. And of course, what is the enemy doing? For 40 days, he's going to be taunting and just calling out names and just tearing them down. And that's what the enemy wants to do to us. He wants to tear us down. He wants to taunt us. He wants to talk trash. That's what the enemy does. And so here's Goliath, and his height was 6 cubits and a span. So a span's a half cubit, and a cubit, the standard cubit, is 18 inches. And you can do some studies on, there's all different types of cubits, but 18 inches is actually on the smaller side. So for what it's worth, typically when you do Bible stuff, you go with a standard Hebrew cubit, smaller than an Egyptian cubit, it's smaller than a Babylonian cubit, but that only means that if you're not using the Hebrew cubit, these things would be bigger. The ark would be bigger. Goliath would be even bigger. But with the Hebrew cubit, that puts him at 9'9". Now, if you look in the back, we've got Goliath back there. He's standing there looking at you. And here's the thing with Goliath is he was not a tall, lanky basketball player. And what I did to make that Goliath was I figured what's the average height of a man? I just said 5'10", okay? When you do the math, he's 1 2/3. It literally came out to 1.67 times the height of an average man. So then I figured, okay, he's got an athletic build. I've got a decent athletic build. I measured my shoulders across. I measured my chest across. I measured my hips across. And I just started multiplying by 1.67 because you don't imagine this tall, lanky guy, right? It's not an even taller version of Brian. It's a huge dude who's as wide. You know, you take Brian and then you put Enrique going the other way, and now you have Goliath, right? That's the idea. He's a big guy. So you look at that, and you have like 44 or 46-inch shoulders across, like a 38-inch from armpit to armpit. It's a big dude. And so you see, I put a belly button on him to make him less intimidating, so no one got scared at church. But there he is. Now in verse 5, it begins to describe him more. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. It's like 126 pounds. I was asking Phil, because I knew he'd have a weighted vest. So like, you got one of those weighted vests? He's like, yeah. Like, is it 126 pounds by chance? He goes, no, it's 40. I'm like, can you get 126? No, it's too heavy. I'm like, okay, well, maybe next time we teach this, we'll try and acquire a weighted vest. But 126 pounds is a lot of weight. I've brought that giant dumbbell twice to church before, and that's 120. It's a big, heavy weight. So to be wearing this on you would be so heavy. In verse 6, he has a bronze armor on his legs, a bronze javelin between his shoulders. So he's got like guns and missiles all coming. He's like a giant walking, mechanical droid thing. And now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Enrique, could you please bring me my spear? Well, Goliath's spear. He's going to bring the spear for us. I made a spear. Now, I only had an 8-foot-long piece of wood available, but most spears are taller than the person. So you have to imagine this will be longer. Now, here, hold it out and point it at me like you're trying to kill me with it. He's always the guy. Okay, but come on, get me. Get me. Ah, ooh, that's heavy. Watch it. Okay, but I made this and put 15 pounds on the end of it. Now, remember, you don't hold a spear right here. No one grabs a spear like, no one does that, right? You get spears from back here, and this thing is not easy to hold. That's 15 pounds. And so when you do the math, here, Enrique, you want the spear back? But this is it. This is a 15-pound headed stick. The stick probably would have been a little thicker and a little longer. Probably would have been a nice round, almost like those wooden dowels for hanging clothes on, like that. And it probably would have been over 10 feet long. I'm assuming, again, a spear is normally like 1.5 the height of a man. It's supposed to create distance. So you got to think that's an 8-foot stick, but the stick might have been twice as long. So it's just insane. Again, he was a big dude. He was a scary, scary dude. And it says in verse 8, then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you, the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So, we already kind of touched on this. That's how it went down. Someone needs to come and fight this Philistine. If the Israelites win, the Philistines, we become your slaves. But if we win, you become our slaves. It's just how it works. And this guy was giant. Now, it doesn't talk about this in this chapter, and I actually didn't even think to prepare and make a few slides with some references to you, but what you'll find out is at the very end of David's career, it kind of wraps up some stories, and he almost gets killed by one of Goliath's brothers as he becomes an older man, and they say like, okay, David, you're probably a little too old to be on the battlefield anymore. So that's way towards the end. So Goliath had 4 brothers. He was one of 5 sons, and they make reference to him being the last of the Anakim. Now, Anak was a giant in Joshua's day, and he had his sons, or the Anakim, just the plural of Anak, his kids. And as Joshua fought, there were giants in the land. When the spies went in the land, they said, there are men that make us feel like grasshoppers. So when you see that guy, now here's what we need to understand, is Goliath is seemingly smaller than potentially the other guys. Because when we hear of Og of Bashan, go back to like Deuteronomy, first couple chapters, chapter 2, I think, and 3 specifically, it makes mention that they killed Og of Bashan, and his bedstand was like 13 feet long. And this was a day and age when you didn't make things oversized, like impractically. You know, you made a bed that fit the person. So people say he was likely over 10 feet tall. So can you imagine now taking Goliath there and adding another foot or 2 to him? You guys should go fight the battle in the Philistines. We're like grasshoppers. We can't go in there, right? And so there were these guys. So Joshua, though, he went in and he killed them all. I love Caleb, right? Joshua and Caleb. Caleb, where do you want to go, Caleb? Caleb's in his 80s or 90s, okay? He wants to go and fight the Anakim. He ends up having his inheritance be there at the mountain where the giants lived, Kirjath Arba, which later became known as Hebron. So it's just kind of a cool thing, these giants. And at the end of Joshua, it makes mention that they pretty much had killed off all the giants except some that remained in Gath and got in the areas of the Philistines. So that leads us up here to Goliath, that we know that there were some giants still left in the land, but the last of those giants were probably Goliath's family that had this giant gene. Now, last thing on giants I'll just say is, again, when you read Genesis 6 and Noah, they were giants in the land in those days and after. So we know, again, that what was going on before the flood, there were giants, and even after the flood, there were some giants. How's that happen? One of the simplest explanations is simply there was Noah and his wife. They were righteous. They had 3 sons, and they had 3 wives. Noah and his sons, the Bible describes them as perfect in their genealogy. It's literally in his generations, I think is what the English may say in some Bibles, but the idea is he's perfect in his genealogy. He was perfectly man. There was no giant to him. But one of the wives may have had a half-giant gene or part-giant gene, and there was enough to pass on some giant gene going on down through the lineage there. So here's this giant. He's going to start a fight, and no one wants to fight him. But now verse 12, our hero shows up. David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, so his dad's Jesse, who had 8 sons. And the man was old, advanced in years, in the days of Saul. We need to remember Jesse is the son of Boaz and Ruth, right? So the story of Ruth leads us up to David and his family. That's why we have Ruth in the Bible, is to show us what led into King David. And so here he is. He's the youngest of 8 sons. There were sisters too. So he's the youngest of a big family. And the 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of the 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. And there's the idea here of the 3 oldest continually were with Saul. They were conscripted, into the military, and they were there. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Now note this, not David occasionally went to Saul, David occasionally went away from Saul. What are we talking about? If you back up and look in chapter 16, verses 14 to the end, to 23, it talks about how Saul was distressed by this troubling spirit, and he would just get all upset. And so people said, well, let's find someone who can play the harp for you. And when that happens, the distressing spirit would go away. It's like this evil spirit didn't like worship. And so when the worship was going, the spirit would leave. And so someone, a servant, we don't know who the servant is, says, well, hey, I know a son. Verse 18. So look at chapter 16, verse 18. I've seen the son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing. Now listen to this. A mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a handsome person. And the Lord is with him. We'll touch on this again in a few verses. But David wasn't a boy, a little boy, as we would think of a boy. He was a man of valor. He had already fought some. It's just he was the youngest, and there were veteran brothers. You know, he could have fought in 3 battles. He could have fought in 5 battles, but he has brothers who are full-time military, and they've been fighting for a long time, and they were seasoned warriors. When we were studying through Daniel, I did a lot of ancient Middle East history. I learned about, Assyria and the Persians and the Greeks. As you learn about, the statue of gold and the silver and the bronze and the Romans and all these different things and the prophecies of Daniel. And I just had so much fun just learning all the history of that time. And one of the favorite stories that I learned about that isn't biblical, it's not part of the Bible, but it's just fun tag along, because they prophesy about Alexander the Great taking over, and then in Daniel chapter 9, or in 11, it specifically mentions how he'll be cut off and it will not go to his posterity, to his own children, but it'll be divided amongst the 4 winds. And his kingdom was divided amongst the 4 generals. And the rest of the chapter of Daniel 11 goes back and forth talking about the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire that pretty much was that area of Asia and Egypt, and how they fought back and forth and all this stuff. Well, in that time, I learned about the silver shields. I'm just throwing these guys out here because this idea of the older brothers being the veteran warriors, and this is just bonus. This has nothing to do with the Bible. You're just learning history now, but it's cool. Because Alexander the Great had an elite force that was called the Silver Shields, and they fought with silver shields. And they were just like his crack troops. I mean, this is the kind of guys, like you think of the 300 Spartans, and you think of some of the men, the mighty men of David. These silver shields, most people don't know about, but they are that kind of men. And after Alexander dies, we're talking like 20, 30 years goes by, 40 years is going by-ish, and the silver shields are still around, the same guys. And the 4 generals were fighting over which one of us gets to have the silver shields. And a battle breaks out, and the silver shields fight, and it's this conflict. The silver shield men are in their 60s, and they end up defeating the young army of like 20-year-old soldiers, because there's just something about being a veteran, being experienced. And so that's the idea of these, you're just a youth. So we're going to get to that with David. Well, you're just a youth, David. You're a boy. And so people always see these Bible stories for kids of little tiny David. No. He was a man. He'd already fought in battles. He just wasn't a seasoned warrior. So I think of the silver shield, just so cool to imagine this group of 60-year-old men just mopping the floor with a bunch of 20-year-olds, with swords and shields and whatnot. And so here we have it. David would return from time to time, but his brothers were veteran warriors at this point. And the Philistine, verse 16 now, back in chapter 17, he drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. Then Jesse said to his son David, take now for your brothers an ephah of dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. So David's going to run an errand for his dad to bring this food. Carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000 and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. So he's going to do this. He's bringing a special treat, for the leader, maybe get them a little special treatment, a better position. And it says Saul and the men are in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So David, verse 20, rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper because he's responsible, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. So what was really going on was every day they'd come and line up and kind of shout at each other. But really they were waiting for Israel to send their champion, because the Philistines already picked their champion. So 40 days, you come out, you line up, you yell at each other a bunch, but no champion was stepping forward. David, verse 22, left his supplies in the hand of a supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words, so David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. And so here you go. Whoever wants to step up, if you can actually beat this guy, you're going to be rich. You're going to be in essentially the kingly line. You're going to be part of the royal family, and your whole house gets to live tax-free. Everyone's happy. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David's got a totally different attitude. David knows who his God is, who God's people are, what God's promises are, and he's so foolish, he believes them all. And he's going to walk them out. The people, right, they said, so shall be done for the man who kills him. Basically what we just read, and it's saying, yeah, this is it. You're going to get the rich, marry his daughter, everyone gets to be tax-free in your family. Now, verse 28, Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. It's fascinating how, again, the big brother is not happy with little brother. Not happy that he's coming. And I mean, David, we're veterans. How could you be someone that God's going to use to do this? And this is something that can be very common. And it's something that as a church we should be careful of and be thinking of, mindful of. Jesus, right? His own brothers did not believe, John 7:5. And we know from Mark that when he went to, I guess Mark and Matthew, they both mentioned, when he goes to Nazareth, right, the people wouldn't believe in him. He says, well, a prophet is not without honor. Prophets get honor, except amongst their own people, amongst his own brethren. And there's the old saying, familiarity breeds contempt. Sometimes people don't want to listen to someone who they're too familiar with, or someone who, they just think, no, it can't be you, someone else. I got to get better advice from better people. I got a funny story about my wife's husband. She always gives a hard time because she'll give me advice, and of course I'm listening and taking it very seriously. And then I'll hear the exact same thing coming from someone else. And I'm like, this is a great idea. She's like, that's exactly what I said. I'm like, I know, but now Pastor so-and-so said it, so it has to be true. And it's funny because sometimes it's like you have people who can speak into your life, but you feel like you need something bigger and better. And for what it's worth too, it's something that more mature believers sometimes aren't as willing to listen to younger believers. Whether it's younger in age, that's a definite thing, or whether it's younger in maturity in the faith, to think that, this person who's only been a believer for a year or two can speak into my life, and I've been a believer for decades. Well, it's the reality that God will use who he wants to use. He's spoken through donkeys, which means he can speak through any of you guys and me. That's the point. So we need to be ready to listen. It's just a little gleaning here that here's David's brother, it can't be David. David could never speak into my life, right? I mean, maybe Pastor Joe, I'll listen to it when he teaches, but if Caleb's up there, it's not going to be the same thing. And heaven forbid Enrique, right? Or any of the other guys we have teach from time to time. And that's the point, though. Sometimes we have these attitudes like, well, this person, he'll speak wisdom into my life, and I'm not going to show up expecting to get much before they even open their mouths, because we just have this attitude of, well, David, how could you even dare to think that you're going to come and fight this battle that we, the veterans, have chosen not to fight? And so here we have it. He comes and he says, we were halfway through 28, and his brother says, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Wow. I know your pride and your insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. What's funny is that I have noticed, personally even, but I've seen it in others as well, that when you are in the moment struggling with envy, quite often you will accuse the other person of pride. because I'm sitting here a little jealous about what they're doing, or I don't like, I'm jealous. I'm envious. Kind of similar but different. I'm envious, so obviously that person's full of pride. And it's something you see. It's just this natural way of like deflecting your own sin on them. It's not that I'm sitting here wishing I could be doing what they're doing. They're just so proud of themselves and so full of themselves. And it's just something that happens. Here's the brother, right? David's showing up. I'm willing. And then he just starts talking down all those few sheep of yours in the wilderness. I know it, David, you've got a pride issue. And David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him toward the other and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. Look at David. He just ignores him and goes on to the next person. Great advice to follow right there. Now, verse 31, when the words of David which he spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and so Saul sends for David. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight the Philistine. No one needs to be upset. I'm here. I'll fight him. That's fine. And so Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. So I'm just going to toss out here, if you're a note taker or whatnot, the word youth here is a word that every now and then it's worth defining because it does clear up some confusing points of Bible stories. It's the word na'ar, N-A hyphen or apostrophe A-R, na'ar. This is the same word used of Isaac. So when Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac, Isaac's not a little boy. He's a grown man, which makes the picture of Abraham sacrificing Isaac all the more better, right? It's not the story of a father hog-tying a son and dragging him up a mountain. It's the story of a son willfully obeying his father's command to offer himself up as a sacrifice. So you'll see again, the idea of little kid Isaac, it kind of ruins the beautiful type of Genesis 22. But no, he's an adult man. And he goes up there of his own. He's carrying enough wood. That's one of the great points. There's the fire, there's the wood, where's the sacrifice, Dad? Who's carrying enough wood to burn a human body? I don't know how much wood that is, and if you know, don't say it, because that would just make you really weird and people would stare at you. I know how much wood it takes to... But the point is that that's probably a lot of wood. So he's got to be a strong young man who's carrying that wood up there. But for what it's worth, too, that same word, na'ar, is also used of Moses by Pharaoh's daughter when she finds him in the little reed ark. And so it really means boy. And we can call a newborn a boy and don't let them know, but a lot of the guys in this church who are in their 20s, I still call them boys too sometimes, right? And that's the point, though, is that it can mean a pretty big span of ages. And so David is a youth. Well, and it usually refers to someone who's not an older, mature man, not a married man. So typically you wouldn't use this of a married man. And that's kind of the idea. So he's not a little kid. We already read he's called a man of war in the previous chapter. But he is making the point. David, you're a young man. This is a veteran soldier who has been fighting for years since he was your age. So it still makes perfect sense. Again, he's a giant to boot. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and took the lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. So here, we have a few good lessons. I mean, this speaks for itself. We can understand what David just said, that he's protecting these sheep. I'm sure even wolves and other animals, but I mean, if you got a lion and a bear, those are probably the two to tell the stories about. But as you sit and think about this, before God has David fight Goliath, God had brought other great trials into David's life. David had less fear. We don't know if he was fearless. But for what it's worth, he came across quite boldly fighting this giant because David had already seen victory in other battles. Now, none of us want to have to defeat a lion or a bear using hand weapons, right? But once you fought a bear, a tall dude is not as scary anymore, is it? And I'll bet you David wasn't happy in the moment. Praise the Lord, a bear to fight and to learn and grow from. This is good, right? We don't do that. But God sends things into our lives to train us and prepare us for future battles that are going to be bigger battles. Something I was thinking about, because he says, right, when I used to keep his father's sheep, was David 5 years old? And dad is sitting there with David and the sling. Okay, we're going to ring. You got to get the thing going around. All right, there you go. And he just misses totally, right? It's okay. Let's keep doing this, And here we go again, David. Here's Jesse and his youngest son, the little boy. There's something special about that. When you have a bunch of kids, the little ones just they're cute and they're special. And the older ones, you don't like them anymore. So they're so cute. Other people's kids. But yeah, come on, David. We're going to swing this sling around, right? And did David get frustrated and throw the sling on the ground? This is stupid. No. Like, you need to learn this. This is part of life. You need to go through and learn these skills because you're going to need it someday with those sheep. And little did he know he'd need it for other things too. But David learned how to throw a sling in his day-to-day life, his day-to-day chores, in the place that God had placed him on earth. God puts us in a specific place with specific experiences to prepare us for what he created us for. I love how Paul tells the Athenians on Mars Hill, right? The idea that God has put you in such a place that men might grope for him. He says, in a time and a place that you were predestined to a time and place so that you would be in the optimal time and place to be used by God for why he created you. But with that comes growing up, life lessons, and lesser trials that prepare us for greater trials. And don't forget, in this story, the lesser trial is hand fighting a bear. So when you think about the trials you're going through, who knows what God is preparing us for? Who knows what good is going to be wrought from these things that we're doing? And so David fights these battles, and now he has confidence when the real one that counts. Sheep could have been lost, right? Things could have happened in those first battles. But now when it counts, David comes with confidence. And so Saul blesses it. All right, David, the Lord be with you. Verse 38, it says, so Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail. So he's dressing like Goliath. Goliath had a helmet, had mail, the whole 9 yards. And David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested. The idea is he's never been in this before. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. And that word tested is it's an interesting word. But the idea is this. We have a couple things to remember. One, David likely never fought with any armor. Unlike the movies, right? You watch even medieval battles, thousands of years later, only knights had armor. And they trained for decades to earn that armor. And the point is that back then, soldiers came with their own weapons and their own armor, whatever they could have. And most people had no money to spend on chainmail, right? They didn't have money and they didn't have the ability to have these things. So David, very, very likely, I would bet my life savings, that he's never worn chainmail before. He's never tried putting all this stuff on. So if it's your first time ever going out to battle, or you're fighting a giant and you've never worn this stuff before, I would feel very uncomfortable using all this stuff. Secondly, tradition of King David is he was an average Jew as far as height, weight, that kind of stuff. And they weren't very big. They were like 5'6". Saul, on the other hand, the Bible tells us he was a whole head and shoulders taller than everyone else. So this is Brian and Arla standing side by side, Saul and David. And the point is, though, is again, like you're putting on by today's standard, figures over 7 foot, right? I mean, it's actually even, it does make Brian and tall people, not that it is. To be standing to someone's shoulder, it's pretty tall dude. So to wear his armor, it just wouldn't work. So, and I only bring that up again, because again, David wasn't a little kid trying adult armor on. It's just, he'd never used armor. And Saul was a really tall guy. And may I throw out the idea that, again, he was dressing like Goliath. I'm not trying to make a point where there is no point, but again, using the world's methods, the world's ways, we see it and we figure like that's got to be the solution. It's sad to see, and over the years, I've seen it. I've never even taken a moment to pay attention to it really, but there's books, how to grow your church. There's series of books that pastors can buy on how to increase, church growth. And it's just what is it? They're marketing books. It's literally using normal, you go and you open that book and then you go how to sell popcorn at the movie theater and you're finding the same stuff in both books. Using the world's methods to try and get God's job done. And that's not what you do. I've always just sworn by what Pastor Chuck used to say back in the day, healthy sheep begat healthy sheep. Real simple church growth program. If you make healthy believers, they will go in turn and make more healthy believers. End of story. Doing things God's way. But here, again, Saul's trying to give David the enemy's armor, other type of armor. And it's David's I don't need that. I'm just going to go and face him the way I know with what I've got. And so it says in verse 40, he took his staff in his hand and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. Again, there's that little riverbed, a little brook. I think I have at home my best stones, the ones I like the most. But this is close to the right size. In fact, just slightly bigger and maybe a little bit rounder and smoother would be a perfect slinging stone. You don't want anything too big because it's just too heavy to get going. But you get something about the size of a golf ball, and that'll kill someone real easy. And he goes to the stream, and it's worth noting, again, to go to that stream, he didn't even have his rocks yet before he made it down into the valley. So he leaves the hilltop of Azekah and comes on down, fully committed to fight this battle, not even having anything with him necessarily. He has a stick, he has a sling, but he doesn't have any rocks. So he goes down, he gets the rocks. Why 5? The Bible doesn't tell us, but some people point out, well, it's not to be presumptuous. And that's a good point. I'm only going to need 1. It's maybe he has a great faith and he only needed 1. But other people also point out, Goliath was one of 5 giants. He has 4 brothers, so who knows? Maybe he had the other 4, you guys are next. David's kind of pointing at them. He goes, he gets his stone, right? And then it says in verse 41, the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. So here's what we know. Goliath's older, so he doesn't like that he's young. He says he's ruddy, that's redheaded. So David was a redhead. And obviously, Goliath hates redheads. Last but not least, David's good looking, which hints at Goliath. I hate good looking people, right? Yep. Because Goliath was probably an ugly giant, like our Goliath back there. Now, I lost my place. There we go. So the Philistine, verse 43, said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The idea is, my God is going to do this to you. And that's kind of the idea of cursing David by his God. And David had his staff. And he's like, am I a dog? You're going to toss a stick for me? And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. But then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with sword and spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Now, right here in verses 44 and 45 is a beautiful picture of confidence in the flesh versus confidence in the spirit. We have a man here. He is big. He is strong. He is experienced. Goliath had every reason to be confident in his flesh. But he's going to be defeated by someone who was humble and was confident in the work of God. That it wasn't going to be David who was going to fight this fight, but that God was going to work through him. And again, pride comes before destruction and a haughty spirit before the fall. When we start thinking that we're so big and so strong and we've arrived and achieved, quite often that comes before a fall because we start trusting our flesh. We start thinking, I've got this now. I finally have got it handled. And then we make stupid choices, we let down our guard, and we forget to trust in the Lord. That's where Paul says, "O foolish Galatians, having begun in the Spirit, are you now going to become perfected in the flesh?" It's just this idea. It's like when you got saved, you knew. At that moment, you knew you had nothing to offer God, and you were wholly relying upon His grace to get you by. But now you think, now I've got this pretty figured out, and I can do it. And then you wonder why you're burning rubber and you're just sitting there, you're not getting any traction because you stopped relying fully upon the Lord. And it's counterintuitive, right? God does foolish things. He likes to confound the mind where we think, well, God is going to make me stronger so I can do it on my own. That makes a lot of sense. But biblically, the idea is fully relying upon God, growing more dependent. See, that's the opposite of human growth, right? Child development class I had to take in college, right? We become more independent as we get older is the idea, but as a Christian, we're supposed to grow more dependent, realizing how much more I just need to lean upon the Lord and rest upon the Lord, and yet somehow I find myself stronger than if I depend upon my own strength. And so here we have the two of them, one fully dependent upon his own strength and the other dependent upon the Lord. Verse 46, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you." David knows it's the Lord who's going to do this. This is what I'm going to do, but it's the Lord who's doing the real work. "And this day I will give the carcass of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." I loved being at a conference and running into this guy who did a breakout session on prayer, and he had his Manny Mill, and he had a book. We used to have his book here. And I remember Manny was just talking about the Lord's Prayer. And I just loved the way he broke down, hallowed be thy name. Hallowed, to be holy, to be revered as holy. We want God's name to be holy, that all the earth may know that there is a God. His name is Jesus, right? He's the God of the church. He's the God of the Christian. We want the whole world to know that, and we want everything we do to make him hallowed. David believes fully, not that he's strong enough to defeat Goliath, but he believes that God desires to defend his own holy name, and therefore God will use little old David by God's mighty power to make God look good and strong. But in the midst of this, David wins the battle. He's even going to get to marry the daughter and get the riches and the tax exemption and all that other stuff. But at the end of the day, the whole reason behind it is hallowing God's name. So we pray, Lord, give us this day our daily bread. Why should God do that for you? Do you know it looks good when the world can see that our God provides for us? It makes him look good. Now, this is not about riches and fame. This is just about God is there for us. He gives us our daily bread. David will say in the Psalms, I've never seen the righteous beg for bread. And I mean, it's a general principle, right? This general principle that God takes care of us. So when you say, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Why? Well, because when we fall in temptation and give in to the evil one, and we call ourselves Christians, how does that make God look? To the outside world, it doesn't look good when Christians are living in sin. And yet, when we're struggling in sin and we want the power to be free from sin, we can pray that prayer. Don't lead me into temptation, God, but deliver me from this. Why? Because it's going to make you look good. And I can pray these prayers with confidence that it's not about me, it's about him. That gives me confidence in prayer. I know when I'm praying selfishly, right? It's usually whenever I'm asking God to change my wife. Then you know it's a selfish prayer. Whenever you're like, Lord, that's why I always love the bless her and change me. That's a good prayer for any spouse. Bless my spouse, Lord, and change me. Now you know you're praying something that God wants to get behind. But that's the idea. And I'm just joking about some stuff here, right? But the point is, it's like, no, I'm praying a selfish prayer. And God's not going to answer my selfish prayers. But if I can think about it and realize, no, this thing right here I'm asking for, God, is to bring you glory. Me falling into sin does not bring you glory. Me being freed from that sin, that brings you glory. You providing my needs brings you glory. And we don't always know how God wants to work and how he wants to answer prayer. But everything from healing and deliverance to daily provision and freedom from sin and temptation, they all bring God glory when done right. So we can pray with a confidence, God, I'm doing this for you, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. That all the earth may know that there is the God of the Bible, and he's still alive, and he's still moving with power today through his church. Then all this assembly shall know, right? Everyone, that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give it you into our hands. It's not about sword and spear. It's not about methods, tricks, and gimmicks. So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran out toward the army to meet the Philistine. I like that. He's proactive. And guys, that's something we could be better at as a church. I just mean the church on the whole. Christians being more proactive, not just responding to the world around them, but going out there and attacking, right? When you think about the gates of hell shall not prevail against Christ's church. Have you ever imagined the church setting up the defense as gates are attacking? Gates don't attack. We're supposed to be attacking, and they're not supposed to last against us. That's the idea. And for what is worth, the decisions of the enemies would do their battle planning in the gates. So there's some stuff behind that. But I just love that picture. Gates don't chase you down. Gates don't attack you. They don't prevail when you're in battle and you're attacking the enemy's gates, not us sitting around waiting and trying to respond to everything in this world, being proactive. So David put his hand, verse 49, in his bag, and he took out a stone, and he slung it. He struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. Once again, rock like this, just a tiny bit bigger, would give you a little bit more weight. It didn't go in his eye socket. It's just, boom, went right into his skull and sunk into his skull. And so therefore, David ran, again, verse 51, and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Adrian, I just want a mural of this in the children's ministry. I'm saying like 8 feet tall, boom. It's just a beautiful, great picture. Anyway, I've always loved that photo, though. Because that's what was going, and look how big Goliath is in his head. I mean, that's reality, honestly, of how big Goliath would have been. But that's what David does. He goes and he chops that giant's head off, and then he goes and he's gonna keep it for a while. I think maybe he pickles it. We'll find out. David, now the men of Israel and Judah, there we go, verse 52, arose and shouted. Look at Israel and Judah are now rising and shouting, and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley of the gates of Ekron, and wounded the Philistines that fell along the road to Sharaim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. So earlier I mentioned how, let's see here, which one I want to go like this. Let's do this one. So Sharaim is right there. And that was a town. And actually what's really cool is they believe that King David later built like a palace there that overlooked the valley where he fought Goliath as like a memorial thing. That David built this so he could kind of go back to where it all started and go just sit there and look over the valley. But remember I mentioned how the Philistine territory was out there in the back. And so here I have gate number 2. Did it work? Clicking. Oh, it's going to take its time to think, I think. It's a slow picture. We'll see if it works. They're really high quality pictures and they take a long time to load. I forgot about that. So this gate is in Sharaim, and you can see that's Sukkah in the background. And this gate was a road, and that road led to the Philistine cities. So when it says they fell along the road to Sharaim, it's the road from the Philistine cities that led up to this city. And I got the slow pictures coming, but the reason the place is called Sharaim, what that literally means in Hebrew is two gates. This is looking in to the gate that faces Azekah. So what's fascinating, and if you've been to Israel, this will click. If you haven't, you'll have to trust us. Every city I've been to, there is one city gate. You really don't see cities with two city gates. This city is known as the city of two gates, one facing towards Israel and one facing the Philistine cities. That's just the last picture, kind of cool. That's actually a gate post hole. So the doors for the city gate, a big post would go in there, so the big city gates would open up wide. So anyway, just some ideas. So this is a city that has two doors, so it's Sharaim. It's the city of two gates. And they chased them all down. Now, notice this. The men who were once afraid, they're now shouting. They're now pursuing. They're chasing down the enemy. It says in 53, the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines. They plundered their tents, right? What we find here with David is one man, one obedient believer in the living God who steps out in faith to go do what no one else was willing to do. I think that's the catch, is they may have been good Jewish men, but no one was willing to step up and go do what needed to be done. But the moment someone started doing it, everyone else begins to catch along. That's something I think we need more of in the church, and maybe you tonight are one of those people where you realize we need more of this. Well, if you go and do it, maybe that'll inspire others to join you. It's one of the reasons why we do things like the street ministry with the signs and other evangelism type things, because those are things that so many Christians are too scared to do. But maybe if we provide opportunities for people to go out there and experience a little, that fear will go away, and then more and more believers will begin sharing their faith actively, being proactive and not reactive. 2 Chronicles, down the road, years from David, God will tell King Asa, the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. That's what God wants to do. Sadly, this is part of a rebuke, because Asa, in his younger days, had trusted God for miraculous victory against his enemy. But now, as an older man, he didn't want to go out to battle, so he just took all the money from the house of the Lord and paid people to come help fight. And God's like, and in this you've done foolishly. That's how the verse actually ends. I didn't put it up there. It's such a downer. But it's true. God's saying, man, Asa, you know, if you had just believed on me like you did in your early days, I would have given you supernatural victory. But now you're paying people to fight for you. I'm looking for people to make strong. All they need is loyal hearts. And that's what David had, was a loyal heart. Hudson Taylor, the great missionary, he said, all God's giants have been weak men who did great things for God because they reckoned on his being with them. And that's David right there, Just God is with me. David believed that God was with him, and that's all that mattered. God's on my side. I don't even have a scenario in my mind where Goliath wins this battle. But I want to think, as David's life went on, David had a heart after God's own heart. And that is what God admired about David, was David's heart. It's one thing to believe God is with you, and God is on the throne, and God is in charge, and God is in control when you're winning the battles. I can't think of an example of David to share. But I bet you there were times where it didn't seem like they were winning the battles. Things were not going the way David had planned. But I bet you David continued to believe God's on the throne, because that's David's heart. He never questioned who his God was. He never questioned his God's power. He did some foolish, stupid things, but he always had a heart for God, even in the midst of his own wicked sins. It says in verse 54 that David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. Now, many of you should know, if you're studiers, students, right? The Israelites did not actually have the city of Jerusalem at this time, which leaves us with two possibilities. One of which is he walked into the city of Jerusalem maybe to taunt the Jebusites who currently live there, like, this is, you're next. I don't know about that. What many people actually believe is that David did legitimately preserve Goliath's head. They could have pickled it. I wasn't even joking. I don't know about, Peter knew Simon the Tanner. Maybe they had a guy who could do taxidermy on Goliath's head. But that's the idea, is that he kept Goliath's head as a trophy. And that when he finally was in Jerusalem, Goliath's head was there as a trophy. So kind of an interesting thought, but again, it's just like, there's the trophy of the giant, this giant head. And he gets his armor and his tent, and later on, we know the Goliath's sword ends up at the tabernacle, because David will get that at a later date. Now, verse 55 to the end is kind of wrapping up. Saul saw David going out against the Philistines. He said to Abner, the commander of his army, Abner, whose son is this youth? Abner said, well, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. So the king asked, inquire whose son this young man is. And then David returned from the slaughter of the Philistines. Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Again, he kept it. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? So David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. I'll only bring this up because it's just kind of people notice it and wonder. Back in chapter 16, the servant who tells Saul about David to come play the harp tells him, I know someone, the son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite. So shouldn't have Saul already known this? Probably not. He was king. David was just a servant boy who played the music, right? I'm assuming the king didn't pay close attention to David at this point. And so when someone one time says, well, I know the son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, Saul probably didn't think much about it. So here now he's actually taking notice, because he's supposed to give tax-exempt status to the entire family. So he needs to know whose family is this that's going to be getting this. Now, I want to wrap up with one last thing. Simply this, is that this story is about David and Goliath. And many of you, I know at least a few of you, are familiar with the Matt Chandler clip of "You're Not David." Because many people try and, you've got giants and you're going to sling your stones and you're going to beat these things. And the reality is this: you can take two extremes of this and miss out. On one end, you make it too focused on you. You start thinking about how you're David and your battles are Goliath and God's going to give you stones. You're going to sling those stones, and it becomes way too you focused. Over here, there's a beautiful picture of Christ in all of this. And I would dare to say you could almost make it too Christ-focused, to the point where you miss out on the real story of David. And there's a lot of practical stuff for us. That's what I was focusing on tonight as we've come to this point. Mostly just, there's a lot of lessons we can learn from this and apply it in our own day-to-day lives of how David handled things is the way we should handle things. But at the end of the day, Jesus, our champion, right? Remember now, he is the champion. As we went through this story, you look at David as a picture of Christ, and it's in there the whole way. He's sent by his father to minister to his brethren. He went to his own, right? That's John 1:11, and he's not received by his brothers, is he? He's mocked by them. So he was sent to his own, and his own received him not. We have Isaiah 53:3, where it talks about he was mocked, right? He was despised and rejected by man. And so we see this picture of David there. Jesus is our champion. He's the one who stands in the middle. 1 Timothy 2:5, there is one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. So we have Jesus, our champion, the one in the middle. Jesus had already fought and won before in the wilderness. It's funny because David was prepared for his battle against Goliath because he had already fought before in the wilderness. Well, Jesus had already faced Satan once, fought him in the wilderness, and he was already been victorious against Satan once before. David rejects Saul's armor. Jesus denies Peter's sword. Put that sword away. I don't need a sword. I could get legions of angels. If I wanted to deal with this with outside sources, I could, but I'm going to go face this battle one-on-one. David faced a terrifying and seemingly undefeatable enemy, and Jesus did too. It was sin and death. That's the idea of the cross and the grave and the resurrection. He was fighting a battle against sin and death, and it is. How can you ever defeat that? Well, Jesus did. The enemy was defeated as a stone rolled away, and I do love that picture. If you ever get a chance, I'm not going to try and, copy or repeat it, but Leonard Ravenhill, and I've heard him in multiple sermons, I've listened to his, he just talks about how, he's in the tomb, and they say he was going to rise on the third day, and it talks about how he's like, so they take the seal on the tomb, they have the guards around the tomb. Satan says, take all the sin of the world and put it upon the tomb. Now take all the demons that we have and hold that stone away. It's almost daylight, and we can just keep them in that tomb. But nope, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, that stone rolled away, and he arises victorious from the grave. And so it's just that idea of the stone. Of course, again, his victory is our victory. When David defeats Goliath, his victory is for all of Israel. Everyone gets to, they're not slaves anymore. We were all going to be slaves to the enemy. But our champion fought, and our champion won. And because of his winning, we become winners. This goes back to this morning. We talked about that legal aspect of salvation. It's literally like a legal courtroom procedure of how, because of what he did, we get the benefit of being set free from our sins. So it's the exact same thing here. And I was like this, he made a spectacle of his enemy. Right? He chops off the head of Goliath. He keeps it on his mantle, I'm sure, next to other trophies. Colossians 2:15, having disarmed principalities and power, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them. And that phrase, principalities and powers, it's always speaking of the spirits and the evil spirits of the realm. And just one last verse to close on. I think that just wraps this up about our victory in Christ and just the similarities between him and David. 1 Corinthians 15, 57 to 58. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. We have victory because of Jesus. We have victory through Jesus. It's all because of Jesus. And so here we see David and Goliath, a beautiful, beautiful picture of that for us, that we have a victory through him. Let's pray, church. Father, we thank you that you've won us the victory, that because of you we have victory. And Lord, I know that tonight there are people who are facing things, God. We are facing many things in our lives, and they can be quite daunting, Lord. They can be extremely discouraging. And so, God, I just pray that you would help us believe that we can still obtain that same victory through you. Whatever it is we're facing, whatever struggle it be that we're having, you are a God who does not change. And you want to make yourself look good through us. You want to show yourself strong through people whose heart is loyal to you. God, we may not feel like we have a lot to offer, but we all have a heart. Help us tonight to leave this place with a full confidence that our heart is yours.